Stanford University.
This right here. So I want to introduce Dr. Bhatnagar, who I would say, essentially founded this field of environmental cardiology. And you guys may not be aware of what this field is all about. But this is a very, very interesting area. And in fact, it's something that my lab has started to get into in terms of understanding how do you model pollutants and how do you model environmental exposures. So just a brief introduction, Dr. Bhatnagar, he's a Smith and Lucille Gibson Professor of Medicine at the University of Louisville. He spent about 25 years studying the impact of toxic substance, tobacco smoke constituents, and also environmental pollutants on heart disease. He's a graduate at Kanpur University in India, and then received his postdoc training at University of Texas Medical Branch at Galveston. He's really known, as I mentioned earlier, for his pioneer work in toxic substances in the ambient air as well as the tobacco smoke. He's published over 190 research articles, and then he's served on more than 50 peer review panels within the NIH, and also a member of the Institute of Medicine's Committee on Secondhand Smoke Exposure and Acute Coronary Events. And then over the past 6 years, he's been a deputy director of the AHA journal, Circulation Research. And his research, his funding, I won't tell you how much funding he does, but he gets tons and tons of funding in this particular area, more than you and I ever have all combined together. Funding from the AIDS, when you think about it, it makes sense. Funding from the, not just the NIH, but the EPA, for example, and also from the AHA as well as the Defense Department. And he currently serves as the director of the Diabetes and Obesity Center at the University of Louisville, as well as the director of the AHA, Tobacco Regulation and Addiction Center. With that, thank you very much for coming in. Yeah.
Thank you, Joe, for this very, very kind introduction and for not disclosing all the funding. It's not just a matter of having a lot of resources, it's also a matter of having a lot of responsibility. And then we sort of have a very large group of people that work together on this, and I'm very proud to be part of that team. So what I thought what I'd do today was to talk about stem cells and diabetes, but there was a quick change in plans, and so I was recruited to talk about environmental cardiology. Of course, I'm thrilled because this is every opportunity I get, I want to talk about this, and it is an interesting new idea, and we are still developing. It's not that there is a field there and that we have sort of, it comes ready-made with some ideas, and we have put all those things together and slapped a label on it and called it something. But we're trying to really develop an understanding of what is the impact of the environment on heart disease. How do we understand it? How do we quantify it? How do we scientifically evaluate it? And after doing all of that, would that make any difference, not only in our understanding of heart disease, but also in our treatment and prevention approaches? So everybody knows this. The heart disease is the leading cause of death in the United States. Most of the people who die from heart disease have coronary artery disease, and there are other cases as well. So there's about 50% of cardiac deaths are coronary artery diseases. So keep that in mind. But it's not just the United States, it's the rest of the world, and this is from the global burden of disease. As you can see, that both in developing and developed countries, I'm trying to see where the pointer is. Yeah, developing and developed countries, that it's usually one or two, the first few cases, leading causes of death. And so it doesn't seem to be a large geographic distribution, and there doesn't seem to be a large difference between even socioeconomic status. Whatever the conditions are that lead to heart disease seem to be everywhere, all around the world. So the question arises then, is heart disease just a natural consequence of being, or of a state of being human? That ultimately all humans, if they live long enough, would succumb to heart disease and would have heart disease of some sort. Is there some fundamental manufacturing defect in humans? So, but if you turn away from humans and look at our closest cousins and be less parochial in our viewpoint, we see that we have a distinguished family tree. And all these great apes diverged maybe 4 to 5 million years ago from humans. But although they have heart disease, this is not coronary artery disease. So most of the chimps have cardiomyopathy, they have fibrosis, and some type of heart failure. In the wild, this is because of ingesting berries with fungus and so on. But in captivity, this is because of cardiac dysfunction. Generally, fibrosis and heart failure is the leading cause of death. On a normal environment with a normal diet, they don't usually develop any coronary artery disease. So which is very rare. So from this, we would conclude that humans as a family do not have a family history of coronary artery disease. So it's not that we are genetically sort of predisposed to have heart disease. If we did, then we would see that our cousins would share some of our genes, would share some of the high prevalence of heart disease. And it's not just even chimps. It's not the great apes, but even as humans, which was, if you go back to like 1910 or 1900, heart disease was not the leading cause of death, and it has suddenly increased over the past few years. But the genes that the chimps have are very similar to what the humans have. And if you look at the genome, there's very little difference, and human genomes differ also very little from each other. There's not much genetic variability. The idea is that at one time during our evolutionary history, the human race actually shrunk to more than 100,000 individuals, and then it expanded, and so there is a very large genetic homogeneity in humans. But the differences between humans and genes and the chimps are 2.5%, but most of the differences are in cognitive genes, not in metabolic genes. So most of our metabolism is very similar to the one that is present in the great apes. And some of the genes that in humans are linked to disease, for example, this is a PPR gamma gene, this is the ABCC1A1 gene, this is the PON or peroxinase. These genes are linked to disease susceptibility in humans, but in the great apes, they are actually ancient alleles, and these alleles do not impart disease risk in these animals, but they do in us. And so the difference between our ancestors, or our cousins, and us is perhaps the environment and not so much the genes. From evolutionary biology, we know well that for a gene to function in harmony with the environment, that there should be an adaptation. So, for example, the PPR gamma gene in the monkeys or in chimps is adapted to the environment, and so there is no disease. However, if you change the environment and the gene gets maladapted, then you do get a mismatch. And this could be a mismatch in which the gene is then positively selected for a different derived allele, gives evolutionary advantage to that population, or there could be also a positive selection in which the derived allele could then be completely different, or it could be maladapted to the environment. Or there could be just genetic drift. And these are different ideas of how we acquire different types of susceptibility genes and how that determines our disease susceptibility. The environment maybe changes more quickly than the genes do, and so that's part of the reason for extinction. And that's where if we cannot adapt to the environment and the gene does not change to become another derived allele, which is adapted to its own environment, then you have a maladaptation and extinction and death and disease. So this whole debate between the gene and the environment is not well cast. There isn't a difference. There are two things that work together, and only when there is an adaptation between the environment and the gene is that there could be health, there could be reproduction, and propagation of a different species. So, couple of examples I want to point out, which one of them is ApoE. Now, ApoE is a gene that is required to take the cholesterol out of the bloodstream, carry to the liver, and deliver the cholesterol back to the liver. It's a very ancient. The ancient gene is about 100,000 years. Well, the ancestral allele is several 100,000 years old, but around 100,000 years ago, the humans acquired an epsilon 3 allele, which is actually in high percent in current human populations, and this is a gene that has low risk of cardiovascular disease versus the ancestral gene. And this allele was derived by living in different environments, and some people speculate that environment was actually domestication of cattle and farming, because you're living in close proximity to animals. There were repeated exposures to endotoxin, and therefore humans who had this gene were better able to soak up endotoxin and protect against recurrent infections. There are other ideas about how this might be important for brain injury. So if you have, apparently the early humans were very susceptible to brain damage. They were butting their heads and breaking their heads all the time. So only those who survived brain injury would live on to reproduce, and part of that was because they had this cholesterol, a slightly different mechanism of cholesterol transport. Another example is the angiotensin gene. And the angiotensin gene is one that's involved in preservation of our body fluids. And so there is one idea that most of the humans, early humans, evolved from Africa, and then they were adapted to the hot savanna for conserving salt by the angiotensin gene. And there's a frequency of this sodium conservation allele. It shows a gradient, a latitudinal gradient, which the gene is more common in Africans than it is in Europeans. And that if you individuals who live in very hot and arid climates are more susceptible to hypertension than people who live in cold, dry climates, who have evolved from cold, dry climates. So the idea is that there are specific domains and features of our ecology that are still present with us that determine our disease susceptibility, and that we are a product of our evolutionary history, and regardless of what the environment we create ourselves and dissociate ourselves from our natural and evolutionary beginnings, they have an important they bear an important influence on our health as well as our disease, and particularly cardiovascular disease. So the heart in particular is sensitive to the evolutionary history because it's an important overall overarching connecting system, and it's also very sensitive to environmental influences. And so even more so than things, other tissues like lung and liver, which we always hear about, the cardiovascular system is much more vulnerable, and I'll show you some data to support that. In general understanding, everybody hears about cancer-causing chemicals. Nobody's ever heard of heart disease-causing chemicals. Although people, for example, smokers, more smokers die from heart disease than from any other types of disease. In fact, the mortality or cardiovascular mortality of smokers is equal to the mortality because of lung cancer and respiratory disease combined. So if we were talking in terms of environmental exposures and pollutants, the cardiovascular system would be the first you look at. But for some historical evidence, we've completely ignored that idea and left it to people who do cancer epidemiology, asthma, COPD, or chronic lung disease. But before we can begin to unravel what the influence of the environment is on heart disease, we need to understand what the environment is and what we mean by it. And so it is important that I define the terms. And in this view, the environment is all that is outside an individual. And to understand, and I think I have it sort of to understand whether this is actually a natural distinction, that whether nature is actually sort of carved at its joints, we need to understand three different domains of the environment. So one is actually the natural domain, or which is the natural environment. And the other is the community environment, which we call the social environment, if you want to call it that. And then the personal environment. Now, a couple of things about this representation. First, notice how the different environments are nested within each other. So the natural environment is the most primordial environment that we are in, the earth, the days and nights, the cycles. And then the community environment, the social environment we build with our community of friends and our socioeconomic status, our neighborhoods. And then personal environment is the environment that we populate with our own choices, and these choices are in part determined by the things that are available to us in our society and those things we choose, and they all have a profound influence on our health. And so what I'm going to do for the rest of the talk is to argue that this is an important influence on heart disease, and that there is significant evidence that each of these components have direct bearing on our disease susceptibility, and that most of the heart disease, and I would submit about 80% or more, is because of the things that are in the environment and not with the individual. So the most sort of primordial feature of our environment are the night cycles of the night and day. Right? We have a diurnal cycle, and all life is entrained to this cycle. That all our genes, or many of our genes, oscillate with the oscillation of the sun and with the coming of night and day, that we know that their disease susceptibility varies from different times of the day. Their susceptibility is different in the morning than in the evening. We know that people who have disturbed circadian rhythms and people who are not synchronized with the day and night cycle have poor health and a very high susceptibility. And you can demonstrate that even for very young individuals. You can keep people away in the dark and disrupt their circadian rhythms, and you can see that almost 100% of them will become insulin resistant in a couple of weeks. We also know this from animal data, that if you do experiments at different times of the day, you actually get different types of results. So there is susceptibility because of our primordial entrainment of our metabolic, genetic, and physiological processes to the day and night cycle. Our cycles of feeding and sleeping and eating and waking up and activity are all completely synchronized to the daylight cycle. But there's more to that. More than that, we also vary to seasons. Things vary with each season. It's known that cholesterol levels are higher in winter than in summer, and that's because of our evolutionary propensity as mammals to hibernate in the winter. So like all mammals, we actually start gathering lots of cholesterol from the summer and try to hoard it for winter. Polar bears do it, whales do it, bears do it, and we don't do that to that extent, but we still have the same predisposition. There are seasonal variations in different types of markers of cardiovascular disease risk. And there is a different mortality that's different in different seasons. For example, in the United States, as well as in England, there are much, much higher rates of cardiac deaths in winter than in summer. And there's just a speculation that, okay, it's because in winter people are indoors and they get infection, and these old people, they get pneumonia and they influenza and they die, and that's just a consequence of winter. This was until a friend of mine did a study. This was in Los Angeles, and you can see a clear demarcation, the difference between cardiovascular deaths in January than there in July. And there's no winter, as you well know, in Los Angeles, right? So it cannot be that it was cold and people are being inside and all these things. So why do we have this? And this is a huge number. This is not something trivial that we're talking about 1 or 2%, at which all the GWAS people would freak out. We got 3% in greater risk or 5% greater risk. This is a 50% greater number of cases. And we have no understanding what reason may be. Some people believe that maybe in the northern hemisphere there is a shedding of leaves in winter, and so there's a decrease in the oxygen in the atmosphere each winter. That may be responsible. Others think that maybe the extent of sunlight. There are these things that we see in humans can also be translated in animals, so this is not just a simple association, but has some biologically plausible mechanisms underlying that. So it may be that maybe in summer that there is more sunlight, and if there is more sunlight, then we need sunlight. What do we need sunlight for? You'll be surprised. We are like plants. We photosynthesize. We are photosynthetic animals, and we synthesize vitamin D from the sun. And each of us are actually, just like plants, wedded to a particular geographic latitude in which we have evolved. So not only that, sunlight regulates wound healing, sunlight regulates production of nitric oxide, sunlight regulates our immune responses, and sunlight regulates vitamin D production. And each person or each group of individuals have evolved to be adapted to one particular part of the latitude, where it depends on the amount of sunlight. So we can, in northern latitudes, there are people who actually would not be able to synthesize any vitamin D because there's very little UV light, because UV light is required for the synthesis of vitamin D. And this ability determines upon skin pigmentation. It is believed that humans evolved in Africa and that they were all dark skinned, and as they moved more and more up to the north, that they lost the skin pigmentation, and it's one of the mechanisms I showed you was positive selection, which means that people with darker skin could not have lived in northern parts of the Europe. They keep dying, and so that lighter and lighter skinned people go up to northern Europe. The reason? If you have vitamin D deficiency, if you have a dark skin, you have vitamin D deficiency, you have very, very large numbers of fetal miscarriages and bone malformation and rickets. So every sort of group of migration that went up from the south to the north had to adapt by changing their skin color. Overall, 3% of our genome is regulated with vitamin D, and there are large differences in how much vitamin D is absorbed in a person. It depends upon the skin color. So say a black person from Africa, and you say take a white person from, say, Sweden, and the black person, so the white person will have third-degree burns before the black person will actually have enough vitamin D in the sun. So that's the enormous amount of difference. So we are still trying to figure out what the role of vitamin D is in heart disease. There have been associative studies. Intervention studies have not been particularly remarkable, but that may be because sunlight has more to do than just vitamin D, and maybe there are other things that need to happen at the same time. There is an association between vitamin D and blood pressure, and this is just the degrees north or south of the equator. As you go south, the blood pressure goes up. As you go north, the blood pressure, or it goes down. In the north you go, the blood pressure goes up. And so there may be some equatorial distribution of blood pressure around the world, and that therefore that may be related to vitamin D. And you can also see that this is blood pressure and this is hypertension. Both of them increase as you go north and up from the equator. And that in some studies at least, that if you supplement people with vitamin D, you can improve insulin sensitivity and you can prevent cardiovascular disease in small trials. There is a big debate of how much vitamin D is necessary, and nobody knows what's the right level, and there is this big debate. The IOM came out with a recommendation. There's a friend of mine, they spent about a year in Africa trying to look at tribes who live in the most pristine part of Africa in the equator to figure out how much, and they don't wear any clothes, so there's how much vitamin D they have. It turns out they have between 80 to 100 units, and so the US current recommendation is around 60, but 80% of the population is less than 40 or 30. So so this is a widespread problem again because of uprooting and movement of people. In addition to the sunlight and the seasons, the altitude is another important sort of characteristic of our natural environment. And as you can see here, that there are lots of people who live in very high places. They live more than 8,000 feet. There are people who have adapted to their environment, and then Tibetans who've been living there for over 50 to 75,000 years. They have developed adaptation. They're particularly well adapted to low oxygen levels. They can exercise in these environments. They have low rates of birth defects. They have much better output. They have different types of hemoglobins than normal land dwellers, and so they have adapted to their environment. Whereas the Andean Indians, who've actually gone to live in the Andes only for the last 15, 20,000 years, have not yet adapted, and so they get more muscularization of the pulmonary artery, and they get LV hypertrophy living there. And even, it was an interesting story, when the Europeans came to the Andes, they took their cattle from Europe to the Andes, and all the cattle died and developed muscularization of the pulmonary artery because they're not adapted to living in high altitudes. So does that have any relevance to a disease? Well, maybe. So this is a small study from Switzerland and the German-Swiss population. It shows that if you are living up more than 1,000 meters, then you have a slightly lower risk of developing heart disease. And then there is some later studies which shown that children who are born in a higher altitude are actually much better, slightly more resistant to heart disease than children who are born at sea level. So we do not know the mechanism. We do not even know very well what the extent of it is. But the point is that it is an important bearing on health. Nobody has, to my knowledge, looked at whether there are geographic susceptibilities to heart disease. Do people live in beaches more sensitive to heart disease? Or people who live in deserts are more sensitive? People who live in grasslands are more sensitive? We don't know all of these things. But I suspect that there may be important differences. But you can't just do the association. You want to see whether if you do an intervention, if something changes in your environment, would that change disease? And so these are two examples of changing the environment. People move from one environment to another environment, would that change the disease risk? And these are very old studies. I'm sure most people know about this. Then when people move from Japan, from Hiroshima to San Francisco, then they saw a large increase in their disease risk. This was after the Second World War. Then Southeast Asians living in UK have higher risk than their counterparts in India. And people did the study that they looked at the people living in England who were Southeast Asians, and they actually went to their first-degree relatives in India and compared the risk and found that people living in UK had higher risk. Didn't surprise anyone, but it brings home the point that there is greater risk if you move to a different environment to which you're not adapted. Even small differences, such as between Finland and Sweden, can make a difference. And there are studies showing the twins that one moved to Finland and one moved to Sweden had different cardiovascular disease risk. Many covariates, some of them are counted, some not accounted, but at least room for further study. But what if you live in the same environment and then the environment changes? And I can present to you 3 examples. Again, these are profound changes, not changes of 5–10%. There is something known as the Finnish miracle. And what happened in Finland was that there was a change in the nutritional programs. By the 1970s and 80s, anybody in Finland who was a young male over the age of 50 had like 60% chance of dying from heart disease, and it was a national crisis. Then Finland joined EU, and when they joined EU, they got fresh fruits and vegetables. They did away with subsidies on fat and pork and lard, and then they switched from tobacco, smoking, to chewing tobacco. And there was a 75% decrease in cardiovascular disease within 20 years. So this is how social change can completely and radically change disease susceptibility without even more medical treatment, intervention, research, discovery, and surgical care. Similarly, in Poland, they changed their oil importation policy that they can change a significant level of cardiovascular mortality. And more remarkably, in China, in just a few years, from 1984 to 1999, you see a 50% increase in cardiovascular disease risk. And this is because people have adopted more and more Western lifestyles. So certainly, you can't expect that genes have suddenly changed in lifetime or in a few generations. And certainly, the disease is imparted by the changes in the environment. So it follows that suddenly the only way we can deal with the disease is to change the environment and not the individual. And I'll sort of talk about that a little bit more. If the disease is originating from the environment, then we need to address the environment and not the individual, because then our efforts are misdirected. And from what we learned from these studies is either you change the environment, the individual remains the same, or you take the individual and put them in a different environment, we get a profound differences in outcomes. And it's to the time we cannot keep ignoring this. But what is it about the environment? Is it the place you live? Is it the people you are around? Or maybe it's both of them. And so this is an interesting study. It shows that, of course, everybody knows that people who are poor live less and people who are rich live longer. Wealth is health. And this has been done many, many times. The two very, very interesting studies. One was done in the Bell Labs in Austin, Texas, followed people for about 35, 40 years, and over 12,000 people or so. And what they found was that people with an educational degree of high school and above live longer than people who are less educated. That was one study. Then there was other studies all throughout the country here and in Europe, that people who are living in wealthier areas were actually much healthier. This is what is only very recent. Till 1940s, the poor were starved and thin and undernourished, where the rich were fat and reclining on their silk pillows and all had heart disease. But something happened in the 1950s and it reversed. So suddenly the rich became thin and healthier, and the poor became fat and they became sicker. And nobody knows why. Complete switch in the population dynamic. But anyway, so we know that wealth makes a big difference. Now, what these people are doing does anything else matter? So they took 3 different neighborhoods with different levels of income. Now, within the same neighborhood, they typed 3 different types of categories of the environment the neighborhood was on. So there's a disadvantage was group number 1, and then the disadvantage second, and group 3, so on. So this most disadvantaged neighborhood was where the grass was not mowed and the windows were broken and there was graffiti on the walls. And you can see that there was so much higher mortality in those areas or cardiovascular events in those areas than it was half in the areas which was well kept, even though they're the same income. So the income is an important determinant, but not the only determinant. And there's something about the environment that we need to feel comfortable, belong to, and be part of, and have cohesive with our social networks. That is going to make a major difference in the disease outcome. And that has to do with our family and friends. And this is the analysis of the famous Framingham heart study. And they're looking at the spread of obesity in social networks. And I don't have a movie for this, but if you want to look at it, it's really interesting. Is how obesity spreads in social networks. And so if you have a friend who is obese, then your chances of being obese are 20%, or even some cases in women, about 50%. And if you have a friend who smokes, then your chances of smoking would be 50% or less. That's the sort of maximum. There's a large confidence interval. But it matters who you're around with. So they were trying to look at as the distribution here. So it seems like that there are clades, or there are little branches where the thin people hang around with other thin people, the fat people hang around with other fat people, and so there is this clustering that happens. And so this profoundly affects your lifestyle, your habits, and your cardiovascular health. And the overall effect could be as large, from 15 to 20%. Now compare that to the risk that's been found with the gene for obesity. The most successful gene is called the fat gene, the fatty acid transporter gene, which is has the strongest association with obesity. But in the best case scenario, it increases your risk by 5%. Whereas having an obese friend that you're close to increases your risk by more than 35%. So the environment has so much more important influence on your health than maybe your genes. But another important component of the environment, of course, is pollution. And I'm going to take a little bit of time and talk about pollution, because that's kind of our major interest is in the lab. But it is a growing problem. Everybody realizes that we have actually polluted the earth with carbon dioxide levels have increased. We have seen that we have changes in ozone levels. We have climate change, and there has been a consistent increase in the temperature of the earth from the last 30 years. Most of this is very recent. In a recent analysis, they did a survey of the earth, the entire planet, and found that there is not 1 kilometer of pristine planet Earth left. That even if you go to the remotest part of Antarctica, you will find traces of PCB, of mercury, lead, in any part of the planet that you want to go. So we have managed to pollute and corrupt every single mile of the planet. So of course, because we are, what I was trying to point out, we are so closely in sync with the environment, so it cannot but impair our health. And one example is how air pollution affects heart disease. The large levels of air pollution can cause a very large number of people who die in China as well as in India. But we can't think of this as a problem that's over there. In the United States, there are 200,000 cases of premature death every year because of air pollution. And the relationship, I'll show you that, is not linear. So we think that we are rather clean, we don't see the air pollution, we don't see the smog, China is so bad. It's not that bad. We are actually quite close. So it is one of the leading causes of death in the world. It's second only to high blood pressure. Tobacco smoking includes secondhand smoke. There is household air pollution. There is ambient air pollution. And if you add all of them together, you'll exceed anything that you can think of. Right? If you put this indoor air and tobacco smoke together, you put the household air pollution and your ambient air pollution, you exceed way out of this graph. So if we are going to talk about global health and trying to control cardiovascular disease and trying to improve global health, we cannot ignore air pollution, and in fact, it should be our #1 concern. What is air pollution after all? Air pollution is a very complex mixture. It contains lots of things. One of the things it contains are what we call particles, and these particles are this is called particulate matter. We call it PM10. 10 is 10 microns. This is the aerodynamic diameter of the particle. The large particles, which are PM10 micron, can be thoracic particles. You inhale them and you cough them out and they go away, not so dangerous. Then there are coarse particles and fine particles, and there are ultrafine particles. The smaller the particle, the worse the outcome, because they go deeper into your lung and can penetrate deep in lung. They come from a variety of sources. They can come from forest fires, cars, trucks, industrial sources. They are stationary and non-stationary sources, anthropomorphic sources and non-anthropomorphic sources. And their composition differs. So this is the composition in Manhattan, where most of the air pollution comes from, or the particulate matter comes from diesel, but it differs in different cities, and this is analysis of different cities, showing that maybe there's some where coal is a major contributor. In other places, there's some mobile sources, or maybe even some residual dust. The way the tires run off the road can generate small particles that we inhale. This is where air pollution is. Unfortunately, this is where I live. This is in Kentucky, where are very large, high levels of air pollution. And this is a big hotspot here, Gary, Indiana, Birmingham. And then, of course, Los Angeles and areas around San Francisco. And in the business, we say that California is where good air goes to die. And so it depends what happens with air, which is, does it make any difference in mortality? And this is a study known as the 6-city study. And they follow 6 cities for about 16 years, and they're looking at mortality in a city as well as pollution in the city. So they found that most polluted cities, for example, Steubenville, Ohio, has the highest level of mortality and also the highest levels of air pollution, whereas other cities such as Topeka have low levels of air pollution and low levels of mortality. But that's, again, it's just a correlation, but it suggests that there may be something to do. What I don't have data here is a follow-up analysis which shows that cities such as Pittsburgh and New York that have cleaned the air have actually seen an increase in the life expectancy. It's not much. It's about 8 months or maybe 6 months. But adding 8 months to the life of an average individual, I think, is a monumental achievement just by decreasing air pollution by 10 microgram per meter cube. So what are these people dying of? Why should air pollution be bad? Why should people die of air pollution? And this is stratification of the different causes of death. Most of the deaths, and this is the number of deaths it shows the circle. And this circle, the bigger the circle, the bigger the number of deaths. And so it means that most people are dying from heart disease, not that there's the COPD is almost negatively associated. Pneumonia is a little bit of a signal there, but not much with lung cancer, not so much with chronic lung disease. So it means that most of the effects are because of exposure to air pollution, because of heart disease. And this is excessive mortality, again, very high in the Midwest, and also very high in California, the Fresno Valley, San Francisco, Los Angeles, San Diego, and other places. Out of the top 10 cities, 6 or 7 are in California. It's not only just cardiovascular disease, there's association between PM levels and diabetes, and you can see that areas which have high levels of PM have high levels of diabetes. Again, just an association, but no causation. We don't know the mechanisms. Let me skip some things, and then I will come back to this study. So we say, how are you going to study this? And so one of the studies that we did was to see what impact air pollution would have on healthy individuals, and we wanted to look at some very sensitive marker of cardiovascular disease. And for that, we went to Salt Lake City, and the characteristic feature of Salt Lake City is it's in a valley, and there is an inversions that happen in winter, and suddenly the levels of air pollution go up. They stay up for 2-3 days, and then they come down. And so we went and we recruited a group of people before, during, and after this inversion, and measured the levels of their endothelial progenitor cells, which are the cells that are suppressed if you're exposed to, say, tobacco smoke and other pollutants. So here you can see that these are the air pollution levels. They go up on one day, and then they come down the next day, and they can go oscillate like this in a predictable fashion. And we recruited people at different times of this graph, or these variations, and it found that as the air pollution increases, the levels of these stem cells in the circulating in the blood decrease, so showing that there may be some disease risk. But again, this was an association, so we wanted to come back and see whether you can test that in animals. So we came back and we constructed this exposure facility with the help of a grant from EPA, where we take the pollutants from downtown Louisville, concentrate them, and expose the mice to these air pollutants. And we found again that as we increase the exposure to these air pollutants, we see a decrease in these circulating stem cells in mice as well. And then we subsequently found that mice that are exposed to these pollutants have higher level of insulin resistance. They are more obese, and they are more susceptible to cardiovascular disease. So I skipped through the mechanisms, and I just want to come to the last part, which is to look at humans. So is in humans the same problem? So we did a study. This is in Louisville. This is about, I think, about 300, 400 people. But for now, we have about 700 people that we have done. And what we were interested in showing, and I will show you here, is to look at whether living in proximity to a roadway would enhance your risk for cardiovascular disease. So we measured stem cell levels and cardiovascular disease risk in people from the distance to the major roadway. And we saw that there was an association, a strong association between distance to a major roadway and their stem cell levels, as well as also their cardiovascular disease risk. So to summarize, we say the exposure to air pollutants, environmental pollutants such as acrid, I didn't show the data, but that's one of the pollutants present in cigarette smoke, can suppress EPCs. We know that particulate matter can prevent the mobilization of these cells from the bone marrow and interfere with signaling mechanisms, and that could be a factor contributing to cardiovascular disease risk. And then they may be contributing to the disease per se. So before ending, I wanted to leave you with a couple of thoughts and a couple of ideas to think about. Heart disease is actually a sum of our choices and the choices that we make. And if we have the choices of living in a clean, or some choices are not up to us to choose, but they're relatively still specific to us. So if you live in a clean environment and we have low levels of risk, we have very low levels of cardiovascular disease. And this is from the Nurses' Health Study. 82% of the coronary events could be because of lack of adherence to good lifestyle. This doesn't even take into account about air pollution and environmental pollutions. So, and it's just not one study. There is a high level, about 92% decrease in acute MI with low-risk behavior. So if you maintain all your risk factors at exactly the appropriate level, it's very unlikely you have heart disease. And then how can you maintain that? By lifestyle factors, by living in areas and by not being desynchronized and all of these things. So if you are in what I would say harmony, or at least adapted to your environment, that you have a low levels of risk. And so most of this cardiovascular disease risk is in the environment. And that keeps on building. These choices keep on accruing, and that we don't see the difference. There are no outward signs of this sort of bad choices we make for an entire lifetime, or the impact of the environment that we have in a lifetime, until one time that this reaches a sort of a precipitous event, and then we go back and try to worry about what happened. What happened was a lifetime of disease burden and wrong choices. But the important point is this. If the environment is contributing to the disease, where is the disease and should the treatment be? For the last many years, and I would say from 1900, we focused on the individual. We are saying that the individual is the cause and the origin of the disease, and therefore the most appropriate targets. Let's discover medicines. Let's discover new types of surgical interventions that can alleviate the suffering of the individual. And then if you want to prevent, let's beat upon the individual to change their lifestyle. We say people are fat and lazy and don't exercise, but we forget that we build cities around them where there's nowhere to walk. So what this idea doesn't incorporate is that the individual is not a self-determined autologous entity, but as a part of a social network and in a certain environment to which that individual is adapted through evolution and has adapted through social interactions. And that is what makes an individual. And so if we keep treating the individual, we are not going to get anywhere with cardiovascular disease. If there are things in the environment, whether the individual is in the wrong environment, whether there is pollution in the environment, whether there is trans fat, whether there is no walking spaces, whether there are McDonald's, whether there's marketing, all of that is going to keep causing heart disease if we keep blaming the individual. So we need to step away from our thinking about where the disease locus and address it. And that's what we were talking about in the morning about the precision medicine. We think that we give drugs to people, and the reason that drugs work in one group of person and not another group of person is because, the genetics is different. But the genetics may be one factor, but I think an important factor could be environmental differences. So if you and I were given the same drug, and I'm exposed every day to benzene at work, I may metabolize the drug in a completely different way because my P450s are all increased, and I'll be completely resistant to the drug, and you would be completely sensitive. And then we would go around hunting for genes. We'd never find anything sensible, or we would find some things that have 2 to 3% or 1% predictability. So I'm not arguing that genes should not be looked at, but I'm arguing that they should always be in the context of the environment. The gene affects the environment in 3 different ways. Whatever genes we have now are determined by the evolutionary environment we were in. Whatever genes that are active in us now depends upon the specific environment we are in. And whatever genes we're going to transmit in the future is going to be determined by the environment, by natural selection. So in each case, whatever the gene interacts, the environment has the primeval influence. And unless we revert back to that sort of thinking, we cannot go forward with our understanding of heart disease or even treating it. So please not to go back to some good old days and return to Eden, but to move forward with an understanding where we can get to heart disease and understand its true origin and attack its very source, and then incorporate both our understanding of the disease as well as both the environment as well as the individual. So we have to systematically decipher these networks of individuals and how they interact with the environment. We have to look at the diseases and how they develop at 3 different levels, the molecular and cellular levels, and how all of this is regulated by both environmental and genetic factors. We want to make sure that we understand that the zip code is as much an important determinant of your health as your genetic code. And we need to incorporate both of them in our understanding in the future. So I want to end here and acknowledge lots of people who are part of this. We have a very large team. The whole group there, we have over 70 people who are part of our center. And 6 other different universities we form as a part of a network, and funding from various generous sources from the federal government as well as from state and local support. Thank you.
Thanks for this fascinating talk. That's why I wanted to pass the talk.
Thank you.
Questions from the audience?
Yes.
So, Aruni, very nice talk. Thank you. It was very enlightening. We all know this, that all the cardiovascular events happen early in the morning, and you showed a slide related to that. How does the environment affect your sleep or vice versa? Is sleep an important factor in terms of the environmental effects on our health?
Well, obviously. So we are, like I said, entrained to day and night cycle. As the sun sets, we all wind down with the feeding cycles over and the sleep techniques, and this is the central mechanisms governing the release of melatonin and by sort of slowing down of brain activity. On the waking cycle, what happens is that since you have down your metabolism, you have to jack it up, increase up in the morning. So as before you wake up, 2 hours before that, your metabolism increases, right? So preparing you for getting up. Otherwise, you get out of the bed, you have low blood pressure, you're going to fall down. So you gear up to that. Your thrombosis are the highest. Your growth hormones are secreted at 4 in the morning before you get up. You have a high degree of cortisol secretion early in the morning, which always happens between 4 to 6 a.m. in the morning before sunrise. And so it makes a huge difference in your susceptibility. Most people think it's thrombosis because your blood is much more susceptible to coagulate in the morning than the afternoon. The interesting story was they did the study on Japanese immigrants. And these Japanese immigrants, not immigrants, they were tourists. And they came from Japan to Hawaii. But they will still have their heart attacks in the morning, Japan time, not Hawaii time. And if they were there for a week, when they were synchronized with Hawaii, then they would have their heart attacks in Hawaiian time and not Tokyo time. So the effect persists for some time, and some believe it's high levels of cortisol secretion in the morning, catecholamine releases highest in the morning, and high levels of blood coagulation. So and then when you get up, the strain of waking up is very large. So when you get up, you get strain, and if you have hemodynamic factors that rupture your plaque, and you have an exaggerated thrombotic response, that forms an occlusive thrombus.
Yeah, Aruni, beautiful talk. Okay. It's really fascinating to hear about these broader influences, and I feel kind of good now that I can blame, instead of my choice of whether I exercise or not, I can say, hey, it's the air and the sun that causes the heart disease. How much estimate have people made in terms of each of these levels of contribution? Like, in the end, presumably we want to intervene, to reduce disease. Should we intervene on the bigger level more so than we should intervening on the individual level?
Right. So that's a major task, is to quantify the contribution of each of these components and subdomains into heart disease. Right now, we understand heart disease with, say, we have risk factors. So we say we have hypertension, diabetes, and cholesterol, and insulin resistance, and we can account for over 90% of the risk. But and then we feel all smug about it. But the problem is that what we have done is said, we have this disease, and you get this disease because you have these other diseases. So we explain disease in terms of another disease, which is a circular argument, and we're all happy. But we have not learned anything. What have we learned? That heart disease is caused by blood pressure? Okay, but what causes blood pressure? With nobody, there are many things. Same thing with dyslipidemia. Everybody says, okay, if you control your lipids, your statin, your disease risk goes down. Nobody seriously in scientific literature has asked the question, why does everybody have high levels of cholesterol in the first place? The cholesterol levels are high because you have constant pollutants and threat. The cholesterol is taken from the liver to actually repair tissues. That's what it's doing. And that's why everybody's cholesterol is high, because you're under stress and your body is saying that there is some injury somewhere that I need to repair. And so cholesterol levels go up. But nobody wants to address all of those. So I think what we need to do is to go back to these very, I would say, proximal causes and not be stuck with and be happy about explaining things just by themselves. And so once we understand that there may be important things, for example, the ApoE gene, which was evolved for living with animals, whether there are other influences that regulate our blood pressure and insulin resistance, those are the sources we need to attack. And then to quantify it, because they may be independent of all of these Framingham risk factors, or they may be working on the risk factors. And we have to quantify the level of dependence as a dependent and independent risk factors. For air pollution, we found that it's an independent risk factor. That same thing with smoking. So smoking cannot, the influence of smoking cannot be accounted for by increase in blood pressure, insulin resistance, or by dyslipidemia, although it changes all of those things. There's a residual risk independent of these. So we need to address smoking by itself. We cannot do other things. Same thing with air pollution.
So Aruni, can you give us a sense in terms of within the field of studying the pollutants and toxicology, what are the standard readouts or standard assays that people use to study the effect of smoking, the effect of pollution in the air, and things like that? What is the typical way that the EPA is studying them, or your lab is studying them?
In animals or humans, or both?
Or both.
Okay.
Yeah. Or cellular cultures, yeah.
Okay, so very, very important question. So 4 years ago, this is the story of a tobacco center. 4 years ago, the EPA came to us and said, if suppose you want to see people, you say people who smoke die of heart disease, what should we measure to figure out that there's a smoking attributable risk in a human clinical trial? Okay? What's the best biomarker readout? Nobody has a clue. Right? So we don't know what to measure. So a whole program that we got, this center grant, was to look at different biomarkers and figure out which is going to be the most informative and sensitive to exposure to cigarette smoke. Same thing with PM. So in the PM, we don't know what the outcomes we should be reading. So what we do, we revert to conventional things. So other labs have done is to measure coronary calcification and intermediate thickness. So CAC and IMT measurements, and follow the subclinical disease progression. We think IL-6 and CRP are good, valid indicators of the total risk, right? And then we measure things such as thromboxane B2 in animals and so on. Those are long-term risks. So short-term risks could be measured, for example, as changes in heart rate variability, changes in heart rate, and changes in blood pressure, whether it's air pollution or whether it's toxicant exposure. The most common effect of any pollutant exposure, whether it's metal, toxicant, is a change in blood pressure. Not even cancer or whatever. So we have to measure these acute effects, which you measure blood pressure, make heart rate variability, and so on for your acute effect, or flow-mediated dilation for humans. So you do FMD measurements to see they're very, very sensitive to changes. But it's very non-specific changes for everything. And same thing with CAC and with IMT. We can measure all these in human studies, but they're not specific to any exposure. So I have a following of people, and I have a whole lot of hate blogs devoted to me. And the people write and stuff say things like, you don't know whether smoking or pollution kills people. You know, somebody dies of cancer, you can open up and say, that's the cancer, that's the person died from this. But can you, somebody dies from heart disease, can you say, oh, this person died because of air pollution, or this person died because of smoking? There's no difference.
Stanford University.